Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. Fundamentals of Harmony is for anyone at any level who wants to go back to basics. I had to move to Paris, France to get proper training in harmony, and in today's episode, we're going to look at how to voice an octave leap in the soprano. Let's begin. So as always, the most important thing is you have to first sing the exercise, okay? This is to hear the harmonic potential. Re, re, si, la, fa, sol, mi, fa. And this will aid you enormously in hearing the cadences, okay? So the first note obviously has to be the tonic, and we're going to put it in the staff because we can't have the bass and soprano at the unison. Then we have a half cadence. Notice how it feels we come to a pause. Re, re, si, la, right? So it's a half cadence. And I'm not sure which octave to put the bass in, so I'm just going to use my gut and then later be open to adjusting. Si, la, fa, sol, mi, fa. Okay. Now, one thing I recommend is to make a chart of the chord possibilities. So if we look over here, in D minor, there's only 4 chords possible for minor chords in the French style. So it's the 1, the 4, the 5, make sure the raise, the leading tone, and the 6. That's all you've got. So when you make a chart of the chord possibilities, we see that the F belongs either to the 1 or belongs to the 6. From there, I decided that this first phrase is an imperfect authentic cadence. If you need more assistance on understanding the differences or hearing the differences or knowing the different uses of the cadences for root position chords, just check out the short tutorial that I have on my website. It's professionally done and it goes into a lot more detail. Now, for a soprano exercise, I recommend writing in the scale degrees because you want to know what's going on in the soprano. And one of the ways you know what's going on is you know how it relates to the global tonic, in this case, D. So when I write in the scale degrees, notice first and foremost that we have a 5-6 in the soprano. So when the bass does 5-6, that's a deceptive cadence for root position. But the soprano and the bass cannot both do the same thing. So in this next example, notice what would happen if I were to voice this as a deceptive cadence. We're going to have parallel octaves. So therefore, kind of a quick kind of assumption or rule you can start thinking, if you're ready for it, is when you see 5-6 in soprano, impossible, we say in French. It's not possible. You cannot have a deceptive cadence because you're going to have parallels. Then for the imperfect authentic cadence at the end of the first phrase, you just follow the basic rules. So you're going to have complete chords. So you need root, third, fifth present at all times. Usually we're going to double the root. And also, don't forget about the path of least resistance. So that means the voices will generally move as little as possible. So they're going to stay in the same note. If not, move by step. Finally, do a leap. There are exceptions, but as much as possible, especially inner voices, you want them en bouche le moins possible. We say in French, you want the inner voices especially to kind of just be very fluid and smooth. This is about convention. This is not about individual expression. Now, also notice that we have a 6-5 going to the 4 going to the 5. The soprano degrees are 6-5. Well, the reason I voice this as a 4 to a 5, again, this is a deceptive cadence in reverse, and the principle still applies. If we look at this chart here, we're going to have parallels if we voice that as a deceptive cadence in reverse in the bass. Therefore, we have to use the 4. Now, one thing to mention is that for root position chords, the 5 going to a 4 is really, really common. This is not something I thought about at first when I first started studying harmony because I had a poor understanding and you're used to think, okay, after a 5, you go to a 6 or you go to a 1. But for root position, because of limitations, many times you do go to a 4 after a 5. Next, I want to test the middle voices. So generally when you're testing the middle voices, you're going to look for a tighter spacing. So in the French style, and I think most styles, there's just a general preference that you have tight spacing. So that means the upper 3 voices are as close together as possible, maybe a little bit more space, but you generally don't look for like a wide, kind of richer spacing, though you honestly need to know both when it comes to orchestration, fugue, and certainly your own compositions. So if we try an espacement serré, c'est in French, so tighter spacing. Notice that it gives us a 12th between the tenor and bass. You can have a 12th between tenor and bass, but it is a little bit risky because the music can sound very thin and empty, like you're missing a fifth voice. Generally, it works best if it's through passing motion, very fleeting. For example, where the half cadence is, I wouldn't want a 12th because it's prolonged and we're going to hear that kind of gap. However, in this case, it's very quick, so ça passe, as they say in French. It's acceptable. Also remember that when the bass moves by step, the other voices are going to move in opposite direction to the bass. This is to avoid parallel fifths and parallel octaves, but of course the exception is for the deceptive cadence, in which the leading tone does have to go up to the tonic. Well, we found a spacing that works for tighter spacing, but what about a wider spacing? Let's say I didn't want that large distance between the tenor and the bass. So in this wider spacing, I recalibrated the voices, rebalanced the chord. So now we have an eighth distance between the bass and the tenor for the 4 chord. And we have just follow basic smooth voice leading, the path of least resistance. However, notice that later on, we had already figured out that tighter spacing, so the upper 3 voices are as close together as possible. So therefore, one of these is going to have to adjust. Now let's focus on the leap, but let's just do a quick inventory. So let's first fill in the missing bass notes. So first off, notice in the first measure, we have okay, we have the 1, we already have the 4 figured out. Okay, so that D in the soprano, if we look at the chart of chord possibilities, it either belongs to 1, 4, or 6. Well, we've already used up 1 and 4 in this measure, so therefore that bass is going to be the B flat for the 6. Remember, with harmony in the French style, you got to change the chord for every single note of the exercise, but there are some exceptions for arpeggios which don't apply in this particular example. Also notice that we have a descending soprano, so si, la, fa, okay, it's 3 notes in a row going down, so your first impulse will be try to oppose that as much as possible. Can we find a bass that's moving in opposite direction? And so here I constructed a line. We have a 4, 5, and 6. All right, so now I want to fill in the middle voices, just make sure it all works. So the first thing to remember is that you want complete harmony for every note of the chord. That's non-negotiable. So in this first example, notice we have the root, the 5th, and the 3rd. So for a 6, usually it's part of the deceptive cadence in which you're going to double the 3rd. But in this case, the 6 is not part of the deceptive cadence, so we do have that freedom to double the root if we should so choose to do so. Also notice that the bass is moving by step, so the other voices are going to move in the opposite direction, except for the deceptive cadence. Notice for the deceptive cadence, we have the leading tone in the tenor, C sharp, going up to the D. Let's talk about the 6 to 4. So when you have a deceptive cadence, the most common default place to go to afterwards, so 5, 6, is to go to a 4. And usually the inner voices will do some kind of leaps to rebalance the chord because we were doubling the 3rd. In this case, as I previously mentioned, we don't need to double the 3rd because it is not part of a deceptive cadence, but it still might be advantageous. Keep in mind that the 3rd of the 6 is the global tonic, so we're in D minor, and the 3rd of the B flat D F chord is going to be a D. I call it la douceur de la tierce doublée in French. Okay, it's the sweetness of the doubled 3rd. It is a nice effect. So even if we're not required to double the 3rd, it may actually be better. And notice, in fact, that when we double the 3rd, we already have the tenor on its destination note. So it has a pedal, so that's nice. All right, so now let's get the octave leap into soprano, the moment we've been waiting for. So for the first chord, we're quite limited because we have an octave between the soprano and the bass, so that's the minimum possible. Okay, the minimum possible distance is an octave. Otherwise, you're not going to have room for the middle voices. So we also need complete chords, so root, 3rd, 5th. Given that soprano and bass are on the root, then we need 3rd and 5th in alto and tenor. So French would say on est bloqué, you're kind of obliged, right, to only do this spacing. That's the only possible thing. Therefore, when we get to the next chord, which we previously had decided, this spacing with the doubled third does not work because we have simultaneous leaps to an octave. When you have two leaps in the same direction, okay, to an octave, it's basically going to sound like parallel octaves. So in this particular case, what you have to think about is the things that are non-negotiable and what can be negotiated with. So certainly the first chord, there's just only one possibility for the reasons we just stated. Therefore, we have to adjust the next chord. So in the solution, notice that I doubled the root, okay? And I have the middle voices jumping to a fifth. So this is a direct fifth. It's not the ideal solution, right? Usually you would not want to have direct fifths, but it is the only possible solution in this example. If you want to do this exercise in full, it is currently up on my website. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.